Donald Trump recently spoke at the Faith and Freedom Coalition, and if you can believe it, he said a number of wild and completely stupid things. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. So I'm convinced if we lived in a world in which magic existed and somebody could put a spell on Donald Trump and prevent him from lying, Donald Trump would simply be mute. He would be incapable of speech. What am I talking about? Well, he recently attended the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Faith and freedom being two things that are wildly associated with Donald Trump for some reason. Whatever. I mean, what an indictment of the Republican Party, the fact that this man still has overwhelming evangelical support, that the party that professes to be that of Jesus Christ has made their current leader, a cult leader, Donald Trump, a man who is the living embodiment of everything that Jesus Christ stood in opposition towards. But separate issue. He spoke at this coalition, and he said a number of predictably stupid and just completely inaccurate things, so we're going to unpack them piece by piece. First up, let's listen to the first clip and hear what Donald has to say about federal authorities demanding that he return government documents back, and then we'll unpack.
America first, and we're doing it for you. But even the New York Times, in a major article, big article, and they must hate, probably the writer was fired after he said this, but it said headlines. It said that when it comes to asking for documents from former presidents, the only power that NARA has is to say, pretty please. Quote, asking nicely is about all they can do, and yet they reported me to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. They don't even have the right to ask. And if they do ask, they have to be very nice, and I don't have to give it. And yet I'm being prosecuted for this. And this is the New York Times saying it. Nothing like this has ever happened before, and hopefully will never.
So Trump is, of course, being very inaccurate and very stupid. He's not an attorney and apparently isn't getting much advice by way of attorneys. He's instead deferring to somebody like Tom Fitton, who is very muscular, but is not an attorney and has no legal expertise to speak of. He's just a deranged cultist. So to be clear, the National Archives has no prosecutorial authority. They're a federal agency, but they can't arrest people, at least as far as I know. So technically, if the New York Times said, hey, listen, the National Archives, when they're trying to collect documents, the only thing they can do is ask. Very technically speaking, that is true because the National Archives doesn't have a gun and handcuffs with which to arrest somebody. If the person in question doesn't comply, then the National Archives has to refer that person to the Department of Justice, which does have arresting and prosecutorial power. So very technically, in a very specific way, it's true. But Donald Trump, being the idiot and non-illegal mind that he is trying to suggest that actually that's literally all the National Archives can do. They can't refer anybody to the Justice Department. All they can do is ask nicely, and you have full discretion to turn them down. That's absolutely not true. They're the good cop in this situation. They'll ask politely, and if you say no, then it's the Department of Justice who steps in with the handcuffs, gun, and everything to say, actually, no, you really need to do it. And they're the ones who execute search warrants and stuff. So I'll also remind everybody that the documents in question were not Donald Trump's. They were government property. Donald Trump is no longer a member of the government. So if the government says, hey, Mr. President, give those back since you're no longer president, Donald Trump was obligated to comply. He didn't, and that's why he's in the situation he's in. It's completely his fault because he's an idiot and completely irrational. So then he also, on this tangent, tries to continue to make false comparisons between himself and a situation with former President Bill Clinton during the Clinton years. And so we'll play this clip and unpack it as well.
It sucks. Let me give you a hint. It has something to do with socks and taking things out in your socks. After leaving the White House, Bill Clinton kept 79 audio tapes in his socks and his sock drawer. So he put them in his sock. I didn't. I put mine in boxes outside of the White House, and the GSA picked them up and delivered them where they were supposed to be delivered.
So what's he talking about? Well, he's talking about during the beginning of the Clinton presidency, I think Clinton was inaugurated in like 1992 or 1993. He was inaugurated in 1993. Bill Clinton engaged in a series of interviews late at night with a journalist for, a book or a personal record. It had nothing to do with government documents. It was an interview that was conducted at Bill Clinton's discretion, and then copies of the tapes were deemed to be Bill Clinton's personal properties, copies of the recordings of the interviews between himself and the reporter. And then years and years later, like 10 years later, a conservative political group tried to sue Clinton into providing the contents of the recordings, and a federal judge said no, because they're not government documents. They have nothing to do with the government. They're just interviews, personal interviews that were conducted between President Clinton and an interviewer in private. And so no one is entitled to those. If Bill Clinton chooses to take those records, which originated in person, it wasn't produced by the government. Bill Clinton, again, of his own volition, engaged with an interviewer in private, off the clock, and kept those. He's not obligated to turn them over. It has nothing to do, that's nowhere near analogous to what Donald Trump had in his possession. The documents that Donald Trump had in his possession were government-generated documents about government-generated secrets, including national defense information. That's not proprietary Trump knowledge. That's not a personal dialogue between Trump and an interviewer. That's not his opinions. Those aren't his journals. Those are government documents about government secrets that he's not entitled to have. If the government wants them back, he was obligated to obey, because Donald Trump is inferior in this position. He's weaker than the government. He's legally not in a position to challenge them. He should have done what he was told and obeyed. But it's Donald Trump, and he refuses to acknowledge the people have power over him. But he's no longer the president. He's no longer the most powerful man in the world. That's Joe Biden. And of course, he can't handle that, so of course he refused, and that's, again, why he's in the legal situation he's in. But the situation with Bill Clinton has absolutely nothing to do with it. If the government had demanded that Donald Trump give his diary back, or if Laura Ingraham conducted interviews with Donald Trump during the Trump presidency, and Trump wanted to keep MP3 files of those recordings or of those interviews and keep them to himself, the government couldn't ask for them back because those are personal records that he's entitled to have. That's not what they asked for back. They asked for national defense information that Trump shouldn't have had in the first place or shouldn't have kept. That's what they wanted back. So the Clinton situation is wildly disanalogous. But it's Donald Trump, so of course he would lie about this sort of thing. So here's another clip in which Trump tries to make the case that really, they're coming after me because I'm standing in their way from getting to you. That's something that he says quite a bit. Let's hear him say it, and we'll unpack it.
Every time the radical left Democrats, Marxists, communists, and fascists indict me, I consider it a great badge of courage. I'm being indicted for you, and I believe the you is more than 200 million people that love our country. They're out there, and they love our country.
Yeah, I'm being indicted for you, because if they can indict me for having national defense information and being a security risk to the United States, well then, my God, they could indict any of you for doing the same thing. Yeah, if any MAGA cultist was in possession of national defense information to which they weren't entitled to have, and they refused to turn it back over to the government authorities demanding that information back, then yeah, they can, would, and should be indicted. So there's nothing like particularly novel about this logic train. But of course, it's Donald Trump here. And what's so sad is so many people have been fooled into this crap. You know, Donald Trump, who is a malignant narcissist par excellence, has convinced tens of millions of people that, in fact, he's a selfless actor acting on their behalf. Now, the last clip I want to play here is actually has nothing to do with the national defense stuff, but it's still part of the Faith and Coalition speech that he gave. And it's basically one in which Donald Trump takes credit for a thing which makes his base really, really happy, but makes the vast majority of the country, including most independents and many conservatives, pretty annoyed. So let's hear what he has to say, and then we'll unpack why this and other statements like it are really good for President Biden and Democrats if they choose to make use of it. Let's hear it from him.
That's not going to happen with them or any of our judges. Exactly 1 year ago today, those justices were the pivotal votes in the Supreme Court's landmark decision ending the constitutional atrocity known as Roe v. Wade.
That right there. So Donald Trump is taking credit for the abolition, or the overturning rather, of Roe v. Wade and federal protections for the right to an abortion. And actually, to give the devil his due here, he has a right to take credit for it, because that wouldn't have happened had he not put 3 Supreme Court justices on the bench. And this is where we get back to elections have consequences, right? Because the Republican Party is, and has been for years, a bad faith, disloyal opposition party with no limiting principle and terrible ethics and terrible values and a terrible governing record, you can't give them the benefit of the doubt. If they win elections, they maximize their opportunity to take power. Now, granted, they won't actually do things to legislate on behalf of even their own constituents, but these like single issue culture war stuff, like getting rid of abortion, tax cuts for the rich, cramming every judicial vacancy with a young, wildly conservative ideologue, they'll do that. And they do that stuff really, really well. And that's why it's important that Republicans lose every single election available. We can't let them win elections. We have to vote them out again and again and again. It's not enough to do it just once or twice. We have to do it consistently. Because defeat is the only language, that's the only limiting principle Republicans understand. They're not going to have a change of heart. They're not going to adhere to conservative principle. They're not going to, they're not going to have a change of heart and actually adopt the Christian values they often profess to have. They only understand, as a group of political actors, power. And the only way to keep them from enacting their regressively conservative agenda, which harms not only progressives and marginalized groups, but their own damn constituents, is to keep them out of power. So we have to make sure that Donald Trump loses in 2024. We have to make sure that the Republican Party in every arena loses in 2024. It's not enough to simply keep this man out of the White House. That's huge. That's probably the single most important thing. We have to make sure that Republicans lose every possible election in order to keep them from doing the sort of damage that they've already done by winning previous elections. So hopefully President Biden and Democrats will make use of sound bites like these, and it will help drive voter turnout, because as we know, generally speaking, when people turn out to vote, that's pretty good for Democrats, given that Democrats and democratic values and democratic policies are just objectively more popular. So, again, let's hope that these words are being harnessed in very productive ways by the left.